If you want the whole, unvarnished story of Marie Antoinette's last weeks, stay with this video and subscribe. There is more to what you think you know. Before the blade, before the crowd, there was a candle guttering on a stone ledge, and the small, stubborn life of a woman who had been made into a symbol. The candle's flame did not betray her. It revealed, in fits and shadows, a past that would not be fully erased by the clamor outside. It is October of 1793. The city's teeth have been bared. Paris moves by rumor and hunger. Within the damp walls of the conciergerie, a prisoner counts days and breath. Prisoner number 280. For 76 days, she has worn captivity like a second skin. Marie Antoinette had once been dressed by servants who arranged pearls and silk as if the world were a mirror that must always reflect her. Now she fitted her hands into coarse sleeves and learned the mathematics of restraint. How many minutes remain until the noon ration? How long before the guard passes the door? How much of her past she can hold without breaking? The courtyard at Versailles, the music, the glitter, were not memories in the abstract. They came back as small, particular things. The scent of roses from the Trianon. The way a courtesan's laugh softened under candlelight. The embroidered handkerchief her son had once tucked into his sleeve. These fragments kept her from dissolving into the public story that had been written for her. They had taken her name from its proper register of affection and turned it into accusation. The tribunals called her crimes, extravagance, conspiracy, treason. They went further, casting allegations designed to stain not only a sovereign, but a mother. Those allegations arrived as paper thunder, printed sheets, cries in the market, fingers pointing at a woman who had no longer the means to answer. She learned bitterly that in a moment of fury, a people could contrive a private narrative and pronounce it public truth. The charges against her, even the foulest whispered among the crowds, served the theater of punishment rather than the mechanics of proof. Inside cell 280, the world narrowed to a few objects that mattered as witnesses. A small lock of hair, carefully wrapped in a scrap of linen, rested in the hollow of her hand like a relic. The hair belonged to none of the famous court ladies. It was a child's curl, lighter and finer, taken from a sketch of memory. The child she had borne, Louis Charles, who had been taken from her. Each night she unrolled the cloth and let her fingers follow the curve of it as though reading a secret. The curl told her what the public had tried to deny, that beneath the crown she had been a woman who had loved and failed and kept loving still. Rosalie moved within this constricted universe as both attendant and witness. She had been with Marie Antoinette through small human ministrations, to bring broth that had not been entirely cooled, to braid and unbraid hair for warmth, to fetch water despite the draughts that sharpened the night. Rosalie's hands smelled of soap and of the city's smoke. She spoke in short sentences that were part practical instruction, part comfort. "Madame," she would say, "it is only damp tonight. Put on the other shift." The Queen answered with the kind of economy a woman learns when talk itself is taxed. A look, the slow shaking of the head, the way her hand found the lock of hair in the dark. Their exchanges were not grand. They were the small acts of custodianship that preserve a person's interior life when public life has been stripped away. There was humiliation in the rituals the revolution set out for her. Her dresses had been taken as evidence, her jewels catalogued as if they were contraband rather than memory. The old courtiers' rooms and the soft hush of Versailles had been replaced by the sour, metallic tang of a prison. She learned to call guards by their boots, to time the scrape of soles on stone. Once, a torch-bearing crowd had pressed so closely to the cart that even the air seemed to have been remade. The torchlight made the faces of the crowd look like cut paper, flat with accusation. She felt eyes upon her that did not seek her face, but the spectacle she offered. A queen made ordinary, a woman reduced to spectacle. Yet within the bracket of that small cell, she staged private rites. She folded a plain white shift, the white linen that would become her garment of departure, with the meticulous care of a liturgist. White, she had learned, was not only penitence in the eyes of her enemies. For her, it was a sheet of clarity, leaving no gilding to distract from the person beneath. She chose, in those quiet hours, the gown that would allow what remained of her dignity to be visible and unadorned. When she smoothed the linen, her fingers found again and again the same fold where a seam had been mended by a hand that loved her. A reminder that the clothes of a life are less about cloth than about who has touched the cloth. Memory arrived like a tide. On some mornings she would be back at a ballroom, watching a young bridegroom cross a room. On others she was a mother singing over a fevered child. The past was not merely a catalogue of wrongs or pleasures, but a reservoir of sensations that fed endurance. She recalled the scent of lemon oil on a summer fan, the slant of light through mirrored doors, the sting of cold when she rode with a thin cloak. These recollections were not indulgence, they were ballast. When the tribunal convened in mid-October, the tempo of her days changed. The courtroom was brass and timbre and the particular music of accusation. Antoine Quentin Fouquier Tinville moved through it as if he were an actor on a stage designed for wrath. He read indictments with a clipped voice that turned paper into thunder. In that chamber, truth and spectacle folded into one another. Witnesses were marshaled, newspapers applauded, and political hunger sharpened into forensic ritual. The proceedings were less about legal demonstration than about the public performance of judgment. The prosecution offered a ledger of sins, financial misdeeds, correspondence with enemies, the charge of high treason. Among these, the most corrosive were the ones that aimed to fracture her identity entirely. Allegations meant to estrange her from motherhood and to make those who loved her doubt her. She found herself confronted with the strategy of spectacle, accusations laid bare to convert private rancor into public certainty. The most painful of these claims touched on her child, Louis Charles. The tribunal's language treated rumor as document. Every whisper could be amplified into an accusation that served the revolutionary narrative. To assert such things in court was to wound, in a different register, the body politic and the personal body at once. Marie Antoinette felt the blow as a breach to the inner rooms of her heart. She had already been robbed of her son's daily presence, and now the public rhetoric sought to rob her of the memory of him as well. Her defense in those days did not take the form of elaborate polemic. She had few weapons of rhetoric in a chamber intent on spectacle. Instead, she carried the weight of her own comportment. The careful politeness born of a life constantly on display, now turned inward and steady. When the questions came, she did not rage. She answered with the clarity of someone who understood that sheer anger could be converted into the very caricature the tribunal wanted. To the crowd's hunger for scandal, she offered instead the small stubbornness of truth as she knew it. That she was a mother, that she had once been a sovereign, that the world had changed around her. The trial sequence accelerated like a tightening rope. Witnesses were called, some with conviction, some with the timidity of those who feared the wrong note. The courtroom buzzed with a kind of public hunger. Notice sheets and pamphlets multiplied outside. Market women debated, and judges presided. Fouquier's questions were precise instruments. He pried at the edges of memory and let the crowd decide how the fracture would be filled. For Marie Antoinette, the experience of being judged was to be reduced to aspects that could be shouted about in the market. The private life that had once been guarded by velvet and gold now lay exposed to public hands. After verdict came sentence. The words guilty and death were given in a form that had been prefigured by months of rumor. The guillotine, that mechanical scaffold of revolutionary justice, became the final designer of fate. The crowd's desire for closure and the Republic's appetite for demonstration found in her execution a twofold spectacle. It was both punishment and pedagogy. Yet even at that hour, when the machinery of the state moved to transform person into lesson, there were human actors whose small gestures reframed the scene. On the morning set for the execution, she dressed in the white gown she had smoothed and chosen. Rosalie helped in silence. Hands communicated where speech would have been theater. There was no display of defiance, no contrivance. She fastened the skirt, tied the bodice with a loop, swift and precise. The white linen took on a different meaning now. Not merely the flag of penitence demanded by the court, but the plain surface upon which she could reclaim a small integrity. Before she left, she held the lock of her child's hair to her lips, as if to press a final benediction. It was a gesture meant for no tribunal, no pamphlet, but only for the memory that would not be allowed to sleep. The cart that bore her cut across Paris like an altar on wheels. Torches pierced the morning fog. The crowd pressed with a hunger that was both public and private. Along the route, faces appeared as facets in a mosaic of accusation and curiosity. Some filled with triumph, others with a thin, ambiguous sympathy that would not be named aloud. The cart's wood creaked under weight, and every jolt seemed to measure the distance between a past of gilded rooms and an imminent end. People tried to fix meaning to the sight. To some, she was a symbol of a corrupt order gone. To others, hidden beneath the spectacle, she was only a woman whose life the city had consumed. When the cart halted beside the scaffold, the mechanics of the ritual took over. Executioners moved like technicians rehearsing a grim choreography. Charles Henry Sanson stood as the hand the state trusted to complete its sentence. He did what he had been appointed to do with the professional reserve that such a task demanded. It is recorded that in the final exchanges there was a small, humane moment. Marie Antoinette, unaware of Sanson's foot, stepped, and it is said she apologized. In a gesture that startled the crowd, she offered pardon for what had been an accidental misstep. Whether the apology moved the executioner or not mattered less than the character it revealed. A woman who, in the last instance, observed the ordinary politeness that had marked her life. The crowd waited for ferocity and was met with an almost domestic courtesy. The blade fell. The mechanics of history did not need graphic detail to make the point. The guillotine accomplished its purpose like any instrument that concludes narrative by closing it. The crowd exhaled in different registers, some with triumph, others with relief or unease. For the city, the spectacle was complete. For those who had loved her in secret, the wound remained open. What followed was the anonymity of the grave. Her body was borne away from the execution and placed in a common pit in the Medellin cemetery, mingled with many others whose names were not to be recalled. There was a ritual erasure in that burial. The mass grave functioned as the revolution's claim to a blank slate, a refusal to preserve the relics of the old order. In the darkness of that communal earth lay a paradox. The attempt to efface an identity only made subsequent memory more determinate. The absence of marked stones became one of the reasons that later generations would search with obsessive care, not simply to honor the dead, but to reclaim a line of dignity that had been denied at the moment of death. In the months and then years that followed, the image of Marie Antoinette metastasized into legend. Painters and pamphleteers, sympathizers and enemies all shaped the afterlife of her story. Some insisted on portraying her as monstrous, others as martyr. The facts remained as anchors: the trial in October, the sentences read, the execution on October 16, 1793, and the anonymity of the burial. But beyond those facts lay the human traces: a woman's last fold of linen, a lock of a child's hair hidden in a pocket, a servant's memory of a hand smoothing a pillow. These were the things that resisted the state's attempt to make her into a mere example. There are days when the moral of such a life distills itself into a simple claim, that dignity can survive indignity. In the narrowest sense, she paid the price imposed by history, a life concluded by state violence and spectacle. Yet in the interior theater of her last weeks, she reconstructed, in the measured acts of care for memory and the small courtesy offered even to the man who would close her days, an essence that could not be confiscated by proclamation. The white linen she chose, the way she pressed the curl of hair to her lips, the quiet exchange with Rosalie, these were not theatrics for history, but the salvations of a person who retained her humanity when the world sought to reduce her to symbol. Outside, Paris moved on, its appetites finding new objects and new rituals of consequence. Inside the conciergerie, those who remained handed down meanings in whispers. In later years, those who believed memory to be a duty searched for bones, for records, for traces. Some of her remains, it is later said, were gathered and reburied in a different, more reverent place, attempts to restore a name where the revolution had preferred oblivion. The reclamation was not a reversal of history. It was an act of remembrance that acknowledged both the political weight of her life and the private truths that made her a mother, a wife, a flawed human being. The shocking truth about her final days is not the lurid scandal the pamphlets promised, nor the tidy moral that some commentators would impose. It is that a life can be attacked by spectacle and yet, in the smallest gestures, reconstruct a private sanctity. The blade and the cart and the public ledger were instruments of rupture. But between them, in the candle's tremor and in the soft linen, a woman kept her name not as a headline, but as an intimate possession. She died in the way the revolution demanded. She lived before that moment in the way any person lives when stripped of everything else. By remembering, by sheltering what is tender, and by refusing to let the crowd's hunger become the measure of what she was. The city's streets remembered her differently for each passerby. Some would recall the sight of the cart, some the whisper of an apology, others the raw politics of an execution. History, however, does what history always does. It holds both the public account and the private traces, allowing us to see that severity and tenderness can coexist in a single arc. In the quiet that followed, the candle that had guttered on a stone ledge continued, in stories and in portraits, to light the image of a woman whose final dignity refused to be entirely extinguished. In the years that folded over Paris like a slow, inevitable tide, the fragments of her life dispersed and reconstituted themselves in ways the revolution could not foresee. Those who had watched the cart carry her away found ways to keep her near. A thread of hair slipped into the palm of a faithful servant. A scrap of embroidered muslin pressed between the leaves of a prayer book. A name spoken in the hush of a corridor where the light seemed to forgive memory its trespass. These small liturgies of recollection multiplied until they became, in their aggregate, a contrary public, an invisible congregation that refused the blank slate promised by the pit at Méline. Rosalie remained among these keepers. For years after the night of the white linen, she moved through the city as a figure both simple and strange. A woman who had been present at an event the state had tried to make exemplary, and who had, out of sheer human fidelity, kept the quiet facts of another human life. She took up the ordinary trades of survival, yet carried with her, in a small chest, and in a mind that would not forget, the patterns of speech, the cadence of a hand, the exacting gentleness of a countenance watched in the last days. People came, in fits and starts, to touch that memory. Some came to charge it with meaning. Others came to pay homage. With every visitor, the contours of Marie Antoinette's afterlife altered. A sentiment here, an anecdote there, until the woman who had been condemned in a courtroom became also a figure of sorrow and of scandal, of reproach and of pity. Artists found her again and again, though each sought to make a different use of the likeness. There were prints that exaggerated the sumptuousness of a dress to indict courtly excess. There were paintings that softened the features until she resembled a martyr from a religious calendar. There were crude caricatures that made her the emblem of everything a people had repudiated. The same face thus served opposing political appetites. To some, she was a cipher for all that must be excised. To others, she was the living proof that the revolution had also taken from the world what it could not afford to lose. Pamphlets multiplied, salons whispered. The story that had once been a juridical act became a palimpsest on which the nation's moral imagination continued to write and to erase. There were, too, those who would not accept the finality of the pit. The absence of a marked stone became, over decades, a summons. Families of the slain, royalists nursing embers of loyalty, scholars with a taste for bones and archives. All of them were drawn by the paradox that made erasure itself into an invitation to remembrance. They searched out maps and ledgers, questioned those whose memories had narrowed to a single night, consulted registers that were sometimes honest and sometimes as inventive as hope. It was a work of devotion and of scholarship, a labor half pious and half forensic. The city yielded, grudgingly, its traces. A name crossed out in a municipal book, a coarse burial shroud noted in a ledger, the testimony of a man who had carried earth to the pit, and could, with the unsteady accuracy of one who had strained to forget, indicate a place. When the monarchy returned in a different form, when the political winds shifted and crowns were no longer an immediate target for sudden violence, these small labors took on new sanction. The restored court, seeking to mend the frayed cloth of national dignity, turned memory into ceremony. The reinterment of those who had been toppled in the convulsions of republican zeal was, on its face, an act of filial respect. Beneath the pageantry lay a deliberate reclaiming. To place a sealed marble where once there had been a hole was to assert that some histories were not to be treated as footnotes. In the slow caravan that bore the remains, or what the sinuous rites of the time declared to be remains, to hallowed ground, the city watched and did not watch. Many could not forget the spectacle that had accompanied the earlier burial. Others felt that a public rite of reparation might bring closure. The procession itself, guarded and somber, was less a reversal of past energies than their translation into a new kind of authority, the sacralized memory of a dynasty. At St. Denis, in that cool dimness between columns and choir, the bones that had lain anonymous in common earth were folded into a different geography. The abbey's stones received them as part of a larger story, a genealogy carved in marble and Gothic shadow. There, among ancestors and saints, the Queen's name once again had a place. The act of reinterment did not, of course, restore the life that had been severed, the son who had died under custody, the intimacies never to be resumed, but it did change the terms by which later men and women would speak of her. History acquired a shrine, memory acquired a stage. Relics that had been hidden in pockets were now venerated by some, commodified by others. The hair that had been kissed in an hour of private sorrow became, in turn, a thing to be displayed, a token in the markets of grief. Yet even the ceremonies and the marble could not decide for everyone what she had been. Doubt and devotion braided together. The queen who entered the abbey came as a figure with many claimants. Some insisted on a narrative of innocence, speaking of captivity and cruel error. Others argued that her life had been a public spectacle whose excesses had geopolitical consequences. Neither account could entirely possess the truth. What remained unassailable were the traces of humanity. A child's lullaby remembered by an old hand, the precise fold of a cuff, the habit of pressing fingers to the mouth when lost in thought. These small facts, when multiplied, resisted the gilded reductionism of both hagiography and indictment. In the drawing rooms of those who had survived exile and in the cramped apartments of those who cherished relics, conversations turned to what memory owed to justice and what justice owed to memory. Was there a moral that the history ought to teach? And if so, to whom did that lesson belong? For some, the lesson was a political caution, that revolutions could devour their own ethical claims when hunger and rumor took the place of deliberation. For others, the lesson was more intimate, that human dignity consists not in the public charades of power, but in the quiet choices made when all visible securities have been removed. In each case, Marie Antoinette stood as a figure caught between usages, a mirror in which a people could see its excesses and its capacity for tenderness. Across a century, the Queen's portrait altered not simply by commission, but by the way people chose to look. Children learned snippets of her story in schoolrooms, filtered by the ideology of the time. Poets wrote elegies that turned on a single imagined moment of mercy. Novelists composed scenes in which she was as much victim as agent. Memory became a literary and civic industry. Memoirs were written that claimed to offer intimate revelations, while legal documents were exhumed to answer questions that had been posed by rumor. The past, in this way, remained a field of contestation. But it was also the source of small consolations. The white linen, the last curl of hair, the hand that smoothed a pillow. These things, passing from mouth to hand to page, became the apparatus by which the state's appetite for exempla. There were grotesqueries, to be sure. The appetite for relics produced curiosities that vulgarized grief. Lockets traded at market prices, fragments of cloth sold as if piety itself were a commodity. Yet these same economies of interest could not wholly extinguish reverence. In parish churches and in private chapels, candles were lit for the repose of a soul that had once been a queen and then an instrument of political pedagogy. The rituals that had been intended to erase became, in some places, the occasion for renewed kindness. Masses said, prayers offered, names spoken aloud in a voice that hoped, against reason, that speech might recompense absence. As the 19th century advanced, the political meaning of her death shifted with the seasons of governance. Where once she had been a headline, she became an emblem, of monarchy to some, of a misunderstood person to others, of the dangers of spectacle to others still. The many faces attributed to her reveal less about the woman herself than about the anxieties and aspirations of those who remembered. Each generation read her as it needed to be read. That she could sustain such contradictory biographies is perhaps the truest testament to the resilience of singular human life against the flattening narratives of power. At the private level, those who had been nearest to her kept the memory as if tending a fragile plant. Rosalie aged into her role as witness. She would, in time, be sought by curious strangers, and later by those who felt a filial duty to preserve testimony. Her recollections, spoken in a voice that trembled with the strain of recollection, were both practical and terrible in their simplicity. She told of the Queen's appetite for small mercies, a request for fresh water on an unseasonably warm day, a note folded with a child's drawing kept in a pocket, the way the Queen deemed ordinary acts of politeness to be the last small defiance against the fate appointed by men. These were not grand confessions, but the accumulated evidence of a life lived in the ordinary register of affection. And long after Rosalie and the others were gone, their stories endured in the archives and the attics of Europe. There, among dust and governed paper, historians and family descendants would sift and dispute. Their labors were not without vanity. Each such inquiry risked making the past serve present needs. Yet there was in their work a humble reward: to be in contact with what had been. At moments, when a letter came into the light or a scrap of fabric was identified with a careful certainty, the past reasserted itself, not as a political symbol, but as a human fact. It is an old irony that attempts at obliteration often produce the forms of memorial that stubbornly outlast the very institutions that sought to erase. The pit at Messaline meant to make her into an example and nothing more, instead occasioned a counter-history. People who would not or could not forget turned absence into a motive for search. What they found, fragments, testimonies, relics, did not compose a neat moral, but rather a mosaic of contradiction. A woman who had loved and erred, who had been regal and vulnerable, who had been used by the public to teach, and who, in the smallest of private life, had taught something else entirely. In the end, perhaps the most enduring lesson is not about crowns or revolutions, but about the manner in which human beings keep one another in the dark and keep one another in the light. Even when the law pronounces a sentence meant to strip away personhood, some men and women, by gestures of remembrance, insist on restoring it. They do so not by overturning history, but by attending to the private acts that resist public judgment. A curl pressed to the lips, a hand smoothed over a cheek, a whispered prayer at an unmarked grave. These are small rebellions against the economy of erasure, and they accumulate until they become a kind of restitution. For those who came after, the scholars who followed ledgers, the artists who repainted a face, the simple descendants who kept a locket in a drawer, the task was never purely to reclaim a name. It was to insist that, whatever the verdicts of politics, the interior life of a human being has a weight that no decree can finally annul. Memory, in that sense, is a moral vocation, a willingness to hold the particular and tender facts of another life as counters to the abstractions that govern the public square. In the candle light of private recollection, a woman's last dignity continued to glow, not as spectacle, but as evidence that humanity, when cherished even in the smallest acts, survives the instruments meant to destroy it. The city's streets adjusted around this remembering. New generations would pass the abbey and glance at marble inscriptions without always knowing the full story. Sometimes a child would ask, an elder would answer in a voice made slow by the weight of retelling. The story changed, as all stories do, but its insistence remained. That a life cannot be wholly reduced to the stage it once occupied. There are, in the end, resistances that belong neither to the state nor to memory alone, but to the ordinary persistence of those who refuse to let another's name be swallowed by earth. And so the candle that once guttered on a stone ledge kept burning in the stories, the portraits, the masses whispered in cramped chapels, and in the quiet acts of those who preserved a scrap of linen or the memory of a hand. In these things, the private truth of her life was guarded, not as an argument against history, but as a witness to it. A witness that insists the measure of a person is never the same as the measure of a moment.